Hello and welcome to today's video. We are going to be talking about a favourite subject of mine today, transgression. As I think most people that watch my channel know, I really enjoy transgressive art. I have studied it for many years. I go out of my way to find examples of transgressive art to experience, and my favourite philosophers, be that Foucault, Postal or similar, all look at transgression and taboo as part of their areas of interest. The topic is relevant to me again right now because I have just finished playing through the re-release of Postal on Nintendo Switch. Having not played anything in the Postal series before, I was naturally interested in this thing that is truly notorious, and I was quite glad to have the chance to play it because it fell into the review cycle. I had an excuse to pick it up. Postal was a game that was banned in something like 13 countries. It is regularly chalked up as one of the nasties of the medium. Politicians loved to grandstand about it back in the day, and it is constantly being written up as a notorious example of transgression in video games. But on playing it, I didn't think it had much of a transgressive impact at all. You can check out my thoughts on the game overall at digitallydownloaded.net, but I wanted to focus on the transgression in this video in particular. The game itself is just fine. I didn't really have any strong thoughts about it one way or the other, but this particular topic I think is quite interesting because I think there is a lack of nuance and understanding in what is genuinely transgressive in video games and what is just controversial. The other forms of art don't seem to have this difficulty in defining the two, but in video games they tend to get mixed up, and I think that is to the detriment of discussing genuine transgression in video games. They are different things, and for me the difference between the two is quite clear, even if it's not immediately apparent when a game, film, book or whatever else is new. So to explain what I mean there, something controversial offends at the time, but only at the time. Something transgressive is more permanent in the questions that it asks of us. So decades later, we're not reassessing whether that thing, that controversy, that topic is still challenging to us. We know it is. There's a difference there between controversy and transgression. So to explain what I mean in particular relevance to Postal, no one's banning Postal now. There aren't politicians up there screeching about how evil it is. Yes, it is a game that remains very violent, and yes, it does hit on some very sensitive topics. One level, for example, is set in a school, but a combination of things have happened in the years since Postal's first release. Firstly, there are far more violent games to generate controversy now, and even more often, people are busy being furious at games from Japan that are playful with the sex themes. That's what is controversial now. What Postal was controversial for no longer really has much of a mainstream impact. Secondly, video games have become so much more detailed and realistic in the graphics. That doesn't necessarily matter in many cases, and certainly doesn't mean much to the quality of the game, but with Postal, it's very much a game that's about visceral violence being done on people. And in that particular case, realism is pretty important, and the fact that it has been since superseded by other video games means that the impact of Postal is much less. If the game looked like The Last of Us 2, it might still have the impact it once did, but not anymore, in part, no small part, because games like The Last of Us 2 now exist. On the other hand, genuine transgression remains confronting. The Marquis de Sade is as uncomfortable to read now as he ever was, and is certainly very highly controversial today, to the point that there is regular calls for his books to be banned or whatever. Lolita is an even stronger example, I think, of something that is very confronting as a dark social satire and has always been there because of the topics that it addresses, and that, again, is a book that is very controversial to this day. If you were to have a conversation about that book in the mainstream, then you are going to deal with a whole bunch of people that are very offended and would think very differently of you if you were to say that you admired the book or whatever. Over in the world of film, films like Battle Royale, Irreversible, A Clockwork Orange, They all remain very memorable precisely for their ability to shock and make you think, and you end up being quite, they put you in a very sobering point of mind. And that is even as far more explicit films have since come and gone. These works are transgressive not simply because they're offensive, but because they use that ability to offend and shock to break through taboo, to transgress, and to make a point. And that last point is the important thing. All of these artworks aren't just offensive for the sake of it. They are actually driving some kind of message through. So to quote Bataille, the essence of morality is a questioning about morality, and the decisive move of human life is to use ceaselessly all light to look for the origin of the opposition between good and evil. It's very wordy, as philosophers tend to be, but the point that he's making is that transgression isn't just about offending, though certainly many transgressive artworks do that. Transgression is about exploring something about morality and what we as a society view as our limit. Postal's problem is that, by design, it doesn't seek to make a point. At a stretch, you could say that it is about indulging senseless violence and is therefore making a point, but without some kind of dark sense of humour or some indication that it's self-aware about what it's doing, it is a very big stretch to get there. It is much more likely that you're going to read Postal as just explicitly violent and senselessly violent without any kind of context, because it doesn't try to put the context in there. By contrast, A Clockwork Orange also indulges and even celebrates humanity's capacity for senseless violence. But in a very sharp contrast to Postal, it's one of the most dense films of all time. The Marquis de Sade's own writings, as another example, as pornographic as they are also sickeningly, gleefully violent, but that's in service of Sade's revolutionary spirit and his desire to tear down the political class and religion. He uses the violence and the sickening kind of material to really drive home his other themes. The thing with video games is that we tend to be very reactionary with them when they sit at the fringes of good taste. If something offends us, then it must therefore be transgressive, and transgressive as a word, therefore, becomes something of a dirty word. That doesn't mean that we can't separate games that simply aim to court controversy with genuine transgressive art. However, we end up with situations like Postal here, which is certainly not the Sade or Clockwork Orange of video games. We are very bad at determining that line between what is just controversial and what is using its controversial material to make a greater point about. So the question then becomes, do we have transgressive games? And that is a good question, and I do believe we do. One good example that immediately springs to mind when I think about the topic is Tokyo Dark. It's an indie game, sure, and in fact most transgressive art is indie, since by definition it's going to put a whole bunch of people off actually playing it, so they don't get much of a budget to play with because they're not going to get that many players. But to get back to Tokyo Dark, it is a horror adventure game thing, and it has a very strong feminist bent. It's also a game made by people who live in Japan but aren't Japanese, creating a weird tone for the game coming from a place of understanding that you need to have. If you live in a country, you understand the place that you live, but at the same time there is that distance there that it can be also a dispassionate observation on Japanese culture and storytelling traditions. It's not offensive as such, but it's transgressive in the way that it deeply challenges a series of moral positions that Japanese society either accepts or turns a blind eye to. It's unsettling rather than offensive, and it's one of the best examples of transgression I've experienced across any media. There's a book that's very much worth reading, and it's also unfortunately very expensive because it's an academic text, but it's called The Paradox of Transgression in Games. It's worth a read for more thoughts on this overall topic. One of the core themes that the book explores is a disconnect of the typical game that other media don't experience. That games that court controversy, shock and offend also need to aim to be deeply rewarding to the player. That is a difference between how games are made and how other art is made. That makes it a little bit difficult, I guess, to be a transgressive artist. Transgressive films, books, and other art forms rarely aim for the experience to be rewarding to the reader or the audience, but rather they try to be sobering. Video games can't really do that, because if the game isn't rewarding, then the game tends to get chalked up as being very bad. With that in context, I would like to point out that the Deadly Premonition games are transgressive in that they don't really aim to be rewarding to play, and I do believe that is actually by design. They're not offensive as such, although there was a bit of Deadly Premonition 2 that was briefly offensive unintentionally, but both were deeply critical of various social cultural behaviours. So for example, Deadly Premonition 2 is a darkly satirical look into the deep south of the USA, and those games back up that kind of social cultural critique with gameplay that is deliberately designed to challenge the player's expectations of a good video game. They are transgressive right down to their very design elements, which makes them really quite unique and well worth playing if you are interested in this topic of transgression and how it might apply to video games. The point to all of this video is that good transgression endures as something thought-provoking and timeless in its approach, because it's more about understanding how people view the world and how they interact with it, rather than simply trying to shock them by finding something that they'll find offensive at the time that they play it. After all, social values are constantly shifting and being reassessed. For transgression to really work as transgression, it needs to make challenging observations no matter where the needle has swung at that point in time in society. The video game industry should stop looking for its transgression in whatever is creating the most controversy at the time, and should instead look at which games are really pushing boundaries and actually causing people to think about their positions, the positions that they would take in various situations, because I think that is really where transgression lies, and I don't think that we're doing a good job of identifying the games that are perhaps the most transgressive out there right now. Anyway, that's enough for this video. Thank you very much for tuning in. Very much like to hear from people that have thoughts about transgression in video games and other art forms. Sound out in the comments and we'll have a chat. Otherwise, please do click that like and subscribe button if you enjoy my videos. That way you will get to watch them all. You'll get a little notification to say there's a new one there and you can go and watch it. Otherwise, if you do enjoy my videos, please do consider backing me on Patreon. It can be just $1 a month, but that contribution will actually help me to grow this channel and do more and more interesting things with it. Thanks as always for watching, and we will see you at the next video.